For much of human history, the boundary between religion and politics did not exist. Ancient kings were viewed as living gods, and early medieval monarchs were revered as semi-divine figures anointed to govern both the bodies and the souls of their subjects. Today, however, the modern world generally operates on a foundational geopolitical concept, the separation of the secular state from the religious sphere. This dramatic shift did not happen peacefully, nor was it the product of a modern democratic awakening. Instead, it was the unintended consequence of the first great constitutional crisis of Europe, a brutal, protracted, and world-altering clash in the 11th century known as the Investiture Controversy. At its core, the Investiture Controversy was a dispute between the Pope in Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor over a seemingly simple administrative question: who had the right to choose, appoint, and install local church officials, like bishops and abbots? Yet beneath this procedural dispute lay a profound battle for supreme authority over the Western world. Before the conflict, the emperor was the unquestioned master of both the empire and the church within it. By the time the dust settled nearly 50 years later, the mystical aura of kingship had been permanently shattered. The Roman Catholic Church had emerged as an independent geopolitical powerhouse, and the conceptual groundwork for the modern, secular nation-state had been firmly laid. To understand why the appointment of church officials sparked a continent-wide civil war, one must look at how medieval Europe was governed following the collapse of the Roman Empire. During the 10th and early 11th centuries, the monarchs of the Holy Roman Empire, a vast decentralized territory encompassing modern-day Germany, Burgundy, and much of Italy, faced a constant threat from their own nobility. Local dukes and counts were ambitious, fiercely independent, and eager to build hereditary dynasties that could challenge the authority of the emperor. To counter this rebellious lay nobility, the early emperors, particularly the Ottonian dynasty, developed a brilliant method of governance known as the Imperial church system. Rather than relying on aristocratic warlords to administer their lands, the emperors entrusted the secular governance of the state to members of the Catholic clergy. Bishops and abbots were transformed into elite administrators, acting as the primary agents of the crown. The logic behind this system was rooted in the strict rules of the church. Because Catholic clergymen were required to remain celibate, they could not produce legitimate heirs. When a bishop or abbot died, his vast lands, wealth, and administrative titles did not pass to a son to form a rival dynasty. Instead, they automatically reverted back to the emperor. The ruler was then free to appoint a new, fiercely loyal confidant to the position. These clerics became known as prince-bishops, wielding the spiritual authority of a religious leader alongside the temporal, secular power of a feudal lord.
Because the entire apparatus of the state relied on these prince-bishops, it was essential for the emperor to control who received these positions. The monarchs achieved this through a ceremony known as investiture. When a new bishop was chosen, the emperor would personally invest him with the physical symbols of his spiritual office, traditionally a pastoral staff known as a crozier and an episcopal ring. In return for the lands and the religious title, the newly minted bishop swore an oath of fealty or homage to the emperor. This oath legally obligated the bishop to provide the crown with both spiritual loyalty and material service, including the collection of taxes, the enforcement of justice, and the provision of knights for the royal army. In this system, there was no separation between church and state. The church was the state, and the emperor was its supreme head. This system functioned relatively smoothly as long as the Holy Roman emperors possessed the military and moral authority to enforce their will upon the papacy, a dynamic that reached its absolute peak under Emperor Henry III. Henry III was a powerful and deeply devout ruler who viewed himself as the ultimate protector of Western Christendom, responsible for ensuring the moral purity of the Church. In 1046, Henry III traveled to Italy to be formally crowned emperor, only to find the papacy in a state of scandalous chaos. Three rival popes, Benedict IX, Sylvester III, and Gregory III, were simultaneously claiming the throne of St. Peter, a crisis orchestrated by warring aristocratic factions within the city of Rome. Some of these popes were accused of blatant corruption, including purchasing the papacy through bribery, a sin known as simony. Determined to clean up the corruption, Henry III took unprecedented action. At the Synod of Sutri in December 1046, he invoked his authority as the divine protector of the Church and deposed all three rival popes. Then he appointed a strict, reform-minded German bishop who took the name Clement I and who promptly crowned Henry as emperor on Christmas Day. Over the next decade, Henry III continued to appoint a series of austere, fiercely moral popes, actively stripping the corrupt Roman nobility of their influence over the Holy See. Historically, Henry III's actions represent a supreme paradox. On the one hand, his intervention at Sutri was the ultimate display of a secular king controlling the church, treating the papacy as if it were just another imperial bishopric. On the other hand, by rescuing the papacy from local corruption and installing passionate reformers, Henry inadvertently created a monster that his successors would not be able to control. The men Henry placed in power brought with them a radical new ideology. They believed that the church, to be truly pure, it had to be completely free from the interference of laymen, including kings and emperors. When Henry III died unexpectedly in 1056 at the age of just 39, he left behind a 6-year-old heir, Henry IV, and a revitalized papacy that was rapidly consolidating its independence. The simmering tension between the empire and the newly militant papacy exploded into open warfare during the reign of Pope Gregory VII, a zealous, uncompromising visionary who ascended to the papal throne in 1073. Gregory was the chief architect of what would become known as the Gregorian Reform. He fundamentally rejected the centuries-old tradition that kings possessed sacred authority over the church. Instead, he argued that the Roman Catholic Church was a divine institution that answered only to God, and that the Pope, as the earthly vicar of Christ, possessed supreme authority over all souls, including those of monarchs. This radical worldview was codified around 1075 in a secret internal memorandum known as the Dictatus Papae, the dictates of the Pope. The document outlined sweeping, unprecedented claims for papal supremacy. It declared that the Pope alone had the power to depose or reinstate bishops, that he alone could make new ecclesiastical laws, and, most shockingly to the medieval mind, that it was lawful for the Pope to depose emperors. Furthermore, Gregory strictly forbade the practice of lay investiture. He threatened to excommunicate any secular ruler who dared to give a bishop the ring and crozier, and any cleric who dared to accept them. For Emperor Henry IV, who had finally come of age and was desperately attempting to reassert the imperial authority that had eroded while he was a child, Gregory's demands were an existential threat. To strip the emperor of his right to appoint bishops was to dismantle the machinery of his entire government. He simply could not rule his vast, unruly empire if he could not select the men who administered it. In 1076, the conflict reached its breaking point. Enraged by the Pope's demands, Henry IV convened a college of loyalist German bishops at the city of Worms. Together, they drafted a furious letter to Rome. Refusing to even use Gregory's papal title, Henry addressed the letter to Hildebrand the false monk, accusing him of usurping the papacy, creating a women's senate, and destroying the peace of the empire. The letter ended with a forceful demand for Gregory to resign immediately, commanding him to descend. Pope Gregory VII's response was swift and catastrophic for the young emperor. In February 1076, the Pope officially excommunicated Henry IV, declaring him deposed from his throne and cutting him off from the Christian community. Crucially, Gregory released all of Henry's subjects from their oaths of fealty and allegiance. In the deeply religious and feudal society of the 11th century, excommunication was a political death sentence. The German princes and dukes who had been looking for an excuse to rebel and weaken the centralized power of the king seized upon the papal decree with enthusiasm. They launched a widespread rebellion and issued an ultimatum to Henry. Unless he could secure forgiveness and absolution from the Pope within a year, they would elect a new king to replace him. Faced with the imminent collapse of his realm, Henry IV forced into a desperate gamble. In the harsh, freezing winter of 1076-1077, the emperor secretly crossed the frozen, treacherous passes of the Alps into Italy. He aimed to intercept the Pope before Gregory could travel to Germany to bless the rebels and crown a rival monarch. Gregory, hearing that the emperor was marching south and fearing a military ambush, sought refuge in the impregnable mountain fortress of Canossa. Canossa was the ancestral stronghold of one of the most remarkable and influential figures of the Middle Ages, Matilda, the Margravine of Tuscany. Often known as the Great Countess, Matilda was an exceptionally educated woman who possessed vast territorial wealth stretching across northern and central Italy. Fluent in several languages and trained in martial arts and military strategy, she was a fierce partisan of the papal reform movement. Out of deep religious conviction, she had transformed her expansive domains into a physical shield for Pope Gregory VII, offering him safe harbor and military backing against the emperor.
In January 1077, the Holy Roman Emperor arrived at the gates of Matilda's fortress. What happened next remains one of the most enduring and dramatic scenes in European history. In a masterful display of political theater and penitential humiliation, Henry laid aside his royal robes and all the trappings of his secular power. Clad only in a wretched, itchy woolen hair shirt and standing completely barefoot in the heavy snow, the emperor waited outside the castle gates for 3 consecutive days, fasting, weeping, and begging for the mercy of the Pope. Inside the fortress, Gregory VII was trapped in a moral and political dilemma. As a brilliant political strategist, Gregory knew that forgiving Henry would instantly restore the emperor's power and alienate the German princes who had rebelled in the Pope's name. However, as a priest, Gregory could not legally or morally refuse absolution to a genuinely penitent sinner who was begging for salvation. Aided by the mediation of Matilda of Tuscany, who served as a crucial diplomatic bridge during the crisis, Gregory finally relented. He opened the gates, lifted the excommunication, and welcomed Henry back into the communion of the Church. The walk to Canossa was a defining moment for Western civilization. For the papacy, it was an unprecedented ideological triumph. The sight of the supreme secular ruler of Christendom groveling in the snow before a priest permanently shattered the mystical, divine aura of kingship. For Henry IV, however, the humiliation was a highly calculated and successful tactical victory. By forcing Gregory to absolve him, Henry successfully neutralized the religious justification for the rebellion in Germany, buying himself the time and the political capital he desperately needed to return home and crush his domestic enemies. The peace forged in the snows of Canossa was destined to be short-lived. Once Henry IV had returned to Germany and violently put down the rebellions, he simply resumed his old practice of appointing and investing bishops. Feeling betrayed, Pope Gregory VII excommunicated and deposed the emperor a second time in 1080. This time, however, the political landscape was entirely different. Henry had consolidated his power, and the second excommunication failed to spark the same widespread outrage. In retaliation, Henry convened a council of his loyalist bishops, declared Gregory a false pope, and elected an anti-pope who took the name Clement III. Then, Henry marched his armies southward into Italy to settle the score with Gregory once and for all. Supported by the unwavering loyalty, immense wealth, and military leadership of Matilda of Tuscany, the papal forces fought a grueling war of attrition against the imperial armies for several years. Despite Matilda's fierce resistance, Henry's forces eventually breached the defenses of Rome in 1084. Pope Gregory VII was forced to barricade himself within the heavily fortified Castel Sant'Angelo, while Henry IV installed his anti-pope in the Lateran Palace and finally received his long-coveted imperial coronation. Facing imminent capture and death, Gregory sent a desperate plea to his somewhat unreliable allies in southern Italy, the Norman warlord Robert Guiscard. Guiscard marched on Rome with a massive, terrifying army that included a large contingent of Muslim Saracen mercenaries.
Outnumbered and unwilling to risk his newly secured crown, Henry IV strategically withdrew his forces from the city, leaving the Roman citizens to face the wrath of the approaching Normans. What followed was the catastrophic sack of Rome of 1084. For 3 days, Guiscard's troops subjected the ancient city to wholesale slaughter, pillaging, and uncontrolled violence. When the desperate Roman populace rose up in armed insurrection against the invaders, the Normans set fire to the city to break the resistance. Vast swaths of Rome were completely gutted, including the historic Capitoline and Palatine hills. Though Guiscard had technically succeeded in rescuing the Pope, the catastrophic destruction of the city turned the surviving Roman citizens violently against Gregory VII. Blamed by the populace for bringing the Norman terror upon them, the Pope was forced to flee his own capital under armed Norman guard. He retired in exile to the southern city of Salerno, where he died a broken man in May 1085. His final bitter words reportedly were, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Yet, while Gregory VII perished in defeat, the ideological revolution he had unleashed outlived him, continuing to reshape the very fabric of European society. As the military conflict raged across Italy and Germany, a parallel war of ideas was being fought in the scriptoria, universities, and royal courts of Europe.
The Investiture Controversy stimulated an explosion of political theory and legal scholarship, fundamentally altering how medieval society understood the concepts of authority, jurisdiction, and the nature of the state.
Prior to the 11th century, kingship was heavily shrouded in religious mysticism. Monarchs were anointed with holy oil in elaborate ceremonies that mirrored the consecration of priests. They were viewed as the Lord's anointed, ruling by divine mandate and serving as the earthly reflection of God's heavenly kingdom. The Gregorian reformers attacked this concept relentlessly, seeking to demystify, degrade, and desacralize the status of the secular ruler. Papal propagandists argued that kings were merely mortal laymen and that their earthly power originated not from a beautiful divine sacrament, but from the brutal historical realities of human conquest, violence, and necessity. In response to this fierce papal assault, royal defenders were forced to articulate entirely new justifications for the authority of the state. One of the most fascinating intellectual products of this era was a series of tracts written around the year 1000, traditionally attributed to an unknown author referred to as the Anonymous of York or the Norman Anonymous.
Commissioned during a similar investiture struggle in England, these treatises attempted to defend the traditional rights of the monarchy through highly sophisticated theological arguments.
The anonymous author developed a complex theory regarding the dual nature of kingship, arguing that while the king was a flawed mortal by nature, he was divine by grace, possessing a unique spiritual authority that was entirely independent of the Pope. Despite these brilliant intellectual defenses, the tide of history was turning against the concept of the magical priest-king. The relentless papal critiques succeeded in stripping the monarchy of its unquestioned liturgical aura. The ultimate response of secular rulers was not to argue theology with the Pope, but to abandon outmoded religious ideologies altogether. Instead of relying on divine magic to justify their rule, monarchs began to build their authority upon the highly pragmatic, rational foundations of administrative efficiency, systematic taxation, and legal bureaucracy. In this way, the papal effort to humiliate and subordinate the state paradoxically accelerated the development of a highly organized, purely secular apparatus of government.
The intellectual breakthrough that ultimately resolved the Investiture Controversy did not occur in the war-torn Holy Roman Empire, but across the English Channel. In the late 11th and 12th centuries, King Henry I of England found himself locked in a bitter investiture dispute with his own leading churchman, Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Like the German emperors, the Norman kings of England claimed the absolute right to appoint and invest all bishops within their realm to maintain control over the country's vast wealth.
Following the strict decrees of the Papacy,
Anselm refused to accept lay investiture or to swear homage to the king, resulting in a prolonged standoff and the archbishop's eventual exile.
The impasse was finally broken through the diplomatic and legal ingenuity of medieval canon lawyers, who proposed a vital conceptual distinction that would change the world. They argued that the office of a bishop was not a single indivisible thing, but rather consisted of two entirely distinct components: the spiritual sphere and the temporal sphere. The spiritual authority of the church, they argued, could only come from God through the pope. However, the temporal properties, the secular lands, the castles, the tax revenues, and the feudal obligations attached to the bishopric were firmly under the control of the earthly king.
This brilliant conceptual breakthrough formed the basis of the Concordat of London, a landmark international treaty signed in August 1107. Under the terms of this agreement, King Henry I formally relinquished his ancient right to invest bishops with the spiritual symbols of the ring and crozier. In exchange, the papacy conceded that before a newly elected bishop could be consecrated by the church, he was legally required to appear before the king in person to do homage and swear an oath of fealty for his physical, temporal properties. In essence, the bishop became a vassal of the king regarding his earthly lands and a servant of the pope regarding his eternal soul. The Concordat of London successfully decoupled the religious from the secular, providing a practical blueprint for peace across the rest of Christendom. The English settlement heavily influenced the ultimate resolution of the conflict back in the Holy Roman Empire. The civil wars sparked by Gregory VII and Henry IV had dragged on for nearly 50 years, devastating the German countryside, destroying cities, and severely weakening the power of the ruling dynasty. By the year 1122, both the exhausted papacy, now led by Pope Calixtus II, and the new emperor, Henry V, were desperate for a negotiated peace. Following intense negotiations that nearly collapsed several times over disputed local elections, an agreement was reached and formally signed near the German city of Worms on September 23, 1122. This treaty, known as the Concordat of Worms, closely mirrored the earlier London Agreement. Emperor Henry V categorically renounced the right to invest bishops and abbots with the spiritual ring and crozier, guaranteeing that the church would have the freedom to elect its own leaders without overt violent coercion. However, Pope Calixtus II granted the emperor highly significant concessions in return. Within the Kingdom of Germany, the emperor or his royal officials were granted the legal right to be present at all ecclesiastical elections. If an election resulted in a dispute between rival candidates, the emperor held the authority to arbitrate and unilaterally decide the outcome. Most importantly, the Concordat of Worms introduced an entirely new physical symbol into the ritual of appointment, the scepter. Prior to his spiritual consecration by the church, the newly elected bishop was required to receive a touch from the emperor's royal scepter. This specific act symbolized the conveyance of the secular lands, economic rights, and royal duties associated with the local bishopric. The Concordat of Worms, which was subsequently ratified by the broader church at the First Council of the Lateran in 1123, officially brought the Investiture Controversy to an end. By formally dividing the appointment ceremony into two highly distinct parts, one purely spiritual, one purely temporal, the treaty legally codified the separation of church and state for the first time in European history.
While the Concordat of Worms is frequently analyzed by historians merely as a diplomatic, religious compromise, it had profound, unintended economic consequences that actively created the modern nation-state. Rather than simply pacifying a religious dispute, the new institutional rules established at Worms fundamentally altered the economic incentives of European rulers, driving a massive, permanent wedge between the interests of the state and those of the Catholic Church. Under the new rules of the Concordat, secular leaders possessed the legally recognized power to reject papal nominees for local bishoprics if they refused to grant them the temporal lands with the scepter. When a secular ruler rejected a nominee, it triggered a vacancy or an interregnum in the local church. During this vacant period, the secular ruler acted as the temporary caretaker of the diocese, which practically meant the king temporarily pocketed all of the local economic resources, tax revenues, and agricultural outputs that would normally flow into the wealthy coffers of the church. This legal loophole created a direct, powerful correlation between the economic wealth of a territory and the political bargaining power of the king. In poor rural regions, holding a diocese vacant generated very little money, meaning the secular lord could not afford a long political standoff. Consequently, the pope easily maintained his dominance in poorer areas. However, in highly prosperous regions, particularly those situated along booming commercial trade routes, the threat of holding a bishopric vacant gave the secular ruler immense financial leverage. Kings and local lords quickly realized that by rejecting a papal nominee in a wealthy city, they could enrich their own treasuries significantly, while simultaneously starving the papacy of crucial income. This dynamic produced an extraordinary shift in the political economy of Europe.
Secular rulers suddenly possessed a massive selfish incentive to promote local economic development, build up infrastructure, and encourage international trade. They recognized that a wealthier territory translated directly into increased political independence from Rome. Conversely, the Catholic Church developed a deeply perverse incentive to suppress rapid economic growth, recognizing that flourishing local economies fueled the rise of autonomous secular kings who could defy the Pope's will. This economic mechanism catalyzed the political secularization of Europe's most prosperous regions by the early 14th century, more than 200 years before the famous Protestant Reformation.
As secular rulers in wealthy areas consolidated their control over local resources, they began to clash aggressively with the papacy over issues of national taxation and total sovereignty. By the late 13th century, powerful, independently wealthy monarchs like King Edward I of England and King Philip IV of France began directly taxing their local clergy to fund their own state-building enterprises and national wars. When the papacy attempted to halt this secular encroachment by issuing decrees asserting absolute papal supremacy, it was met not with submission but with overwhelming secular military force. The balance of power had irreversibly shifted from the religious to the secular sphere, purchased by the economic wealth of the growing European states. The Investiture Controversy was far more than a technical squabble over ecclesiastical protocol and the handing out of rings and staffs. It was the great crucible in which the modern political architecture of the West was forged. What began in the 1070s as a violent personal collision between two universalist visions, a divinely ordained emperor versus an absolutely supreme pope, ultimately exhausted both ancient concepts.
In their desperate, decades-long attempts to secure the upper hand, the protagonists of the investiture crisis dismantled the ancient monolithic integration of the sacred and the profane. The papacy successfully shattered the aura of the magical priest-king, forcing monarchs to abandon divine justification in favor of practical, bureaucratic, and legal legitimacy. Simultaneously, the diplomatic resolutions at London and Worms codified the existence of two completely separate jurisdictions, the spiritual realm governed by the Church and the temporal realm governed by the state. Most crucially, the institutional mechanics of the final settlement incentivized secular rulers to aggressively pursue economic development as a means of ensuring their political sovereignty against the Church. By tying political leverage to territorial wealth, the resolutions of the 11th century fostered the rapid growth of secular authority in Europe's most prosperous regions. This process of state-building and secularization laid the permanent foundations for the modern sovereign nation-state, establishing the enduring, world-changing principle that the governance of the soul and the governance of the earthly realm are and must remain fundamentally distinct entities.